Okay, picking up where we left off, we're still on table 3.4 on page 137, talking about the three major categories: the portable, stationary, and multi-user. So these are servers. And so servers allow you to have, 3 or 4 people simultaneously dealing with it. Not so much. Most desktop computers have a maximum of 2 different people that can be working on it. One person, on the machine, and then one person via the network. But if you had like 5 or 6 people that wanted to get there, well, it's not going to work. That's why you need servers. And there's a class of servers, normal everyday server, mainframe computers. Though, yes, those still exist. And then supercomputers if you were doing research. Okay. So, let's continue. So, come on. Everyone's seen all that before. Non-portable. Obviously, I'm skipping this because everyone knows all about this. Oh, wait a minute. There is one thing in here called a blade server. If I have a server, and most servers now have it, so you don't have to decide when you buy the server. You don't have to decide like how many CPU cores that are going to be in it. It has a spot where you can plug in as many as will physically fit. So let's say you buy the server and you have 4 CPU cores. And then you go, that'll work but by next year I'm going to need some more. Well, instead of buying a whole new computer, you buy what's called a blade, and you take the blade and you stick it in this slot. So now you have 8. You buy another one, you stick it in, now I have 12. And just keep sticking blades in until you could have a card cage that can hold 16 slots. And so a blade server allows you to scale. So scalability is a neat feature of servers. And they're designed, of course, for doing that. Virtual servers. So virtual servers are things like I mentioned before, where I could have one physical server, and then have it broken up so it looks like 3 different servers. It could look like a database server, a web server, and a file server. And they would have 3 different machine names. You could, 3 different copies of the operating system. It would quite literally be 3 separate machines, but they're all virtual. Okay. Weird concept. So I have one physical machine that acts like 3 separate physical machines. They look like physical machines. You log into them and ask them who they are, and they tell you. Ask them how much storage, they tell you. They ask them how much RAM it's got, they tell you. This is a really cool way of doing business. If you're trying to reduce the number of physical servers in an environment, virtual is the way to go. That way if you had 16 servers, physical servers, you could probably get away with putting 4 servers together and having 4 each. And the users would never know. They would never know that there's not 16 servers out there because the servers are still there as far as they're concerned. They would the only way they would know that they weren't 16 is they'd peek in the door in the server room and go, "Hey, where'd all the boxes go?" Okay. So virtual servers. That probably wasn't a very good explanation, but you can read the text and figure it out. So virtual servers and blade servers. Okay. So here's a spot where there's an awful lot of spare places where I can plug in more blades. Pop one of these little covers off, slap another blade in there, and scale out. Okay. I'm going to talk about, the next thing they talk about is data centers. So, a lot of companies use cloud computing. And so they outsource an awful lot of their stuff, and they go to the gargantuan data centers. Now, you might be in a company that's big enough to have your own data center. There's not that many that are big enough to do that. But if you're IBM or something, yeah, you can have your own data center. You bet. But most people don't. Most people hire this out. And so data centers are basically a purpose-built building where you have just rows and rows and rows of computers, and they're all dedicated for just doing computer kinds of things. It's kind of interesting. So data centers, mostly buildings, although I did see this really cool video a few years back where Microsoft was putting together a data center, and instead of putting them inside a building, what they did is they have them on tractor-trailer rigs. And so you would pull in an entire module and just drop it off and then plug it in, and then pull up a next one. And it was kind of cool because if one of their something went wrong with it, all they just detach it and hook it up to a truck and drive off with it and replace it with another one. They don't. For some reason, they're not doing that anymore. Now it's all just racks and racks and racks of stuff inside buildings. But so data centers are mostly about the physical environment in order to have lots and lots of data. Let's talk about what it would take to build a data center, other than money. Really, it's talking about three different things. I need to have access to electrical power. Yeah. I need to have access to high-speed access to the internet. So you're going to have to be near a major internet backbone somehow. And you need lots and lots of cooling because these suckers produce a lot of heat. Okay, so when Microsoft comes down and says, well, I think we need to build a data center, they're going to be looking at three things. Is there enough electrical power, and how expensive is it? Is there a high-speed internet hub somewhere in the area? Otherwise, I'll have to build one. And then where am I going to get the cooling? Now, the cooling could be completely electrical. You could just put air conditioning systems in. That's one way. But I've seen some really cool places where they've used river water or lake water or all sorts of weird things, geothermal wells, all sorts of unusual ways of reducing their cooling cost. And so those are the three factors. There's also a really weird story that I like to tell. It talks about, like the EU, the European Union, decided that in order for their laws to be applicable to storage, all data from an EU country must be stored in a data center that's in an EU country. So France, for example, can't store its data in North Carolina. They can't. They have to store it in some EU country. All right, so when Microsoft learned that they were going to do this, they went, ah! So they built a huge data center in Ireland so they could keep the business that they had, because they had some business going on before this rule came out. And so that provided them an opportunity to go build a new data center in Ireland so that when the law went into effect, they could move all their data over there, and all of the EU data is in an EU country. Okay. So that's what it is about data centers. Again, this modular data center concept, this is like a tractor-trailer rig or a Connex container where, in fact, these things, I've seen these, where there's not enough physical room to put a human inside this thing. I mean, those things are built and they're bolted up on the sides and they're shipped off to the site. In other words, if something goes wrong, you can either get to it from the outside or that's it. You're going to take the thing apart. So these things are kind of tight. So this modular data center. Although, like I said, I haven't seen too many of those now. Most of them are just normal looking things in a building. Green computing. Other countries have been spending an awful lot of energy, good choice of words, awful lot of effort in making sure that the computers that we buy are good for the environment. And there's an awful lot of things involved. One of which is the toxic materials used during construction. Okay, so as I'm building my CPU chip or my RAM chip or my hard drive or the plastic case, whatever it is, as I'm building it, how much hazardous material or waste am I generating? So during construction, that's one. And then the other one is how much toxic material is physically in the product. Okay, for example, fluorescent lights have a tiny amount of mercury. I mean, it's not much, but a little bit amount of mercury in them. So you can't just take a bunch of fluorescent lights and just take them to the landfill, because they have, even though they're safe to use, when you gather them all together and dump them in a hole, well, then you could leak out a bunch of stuff. So toxic materials during construction, toxic material in the product, inside the product. The next one talks about user serviceable parts. So, for example, is your machine designed to be thrown away at the end of life? There's no upgrade. For example, I buy a brand new tablet computer and I cannot replace the battery. There's no user serviceable part. So when the battery goes out, I go, well, I guess I'll just throw this one away and buy me another one. Okay, so green computing gives a score for how much of the user serviceable parts there are. And then lastly is on energy use. These devices can consume an awful lot of energy. And so there's this thing, electronic patent environment assessment tool, and European Union uses this a lot. We don't quite as much. And they basically give you these 23 categories. I just mentioned a few. 23 categories of these things, and if you meet them, you can either be bronze, silver, or gold, about how well you're doing. All right. So this is kind of sort of important, and it kind of goes back to the thing about the data centers. The data centers produce a great deal of heat, and so if you have alternate ways of cooling, then you get good scores, so to speak. Plus, it's less money to spend to the electric company. All right. So we have reached the end of the chapter. Ta-da! I will see you guys again in some future chapter.